Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Anti-Federalist Radio, providing you with libertarian perspectives and opinions on current events for the liberty-minded. We are taking the fight to the airwaves as we stand for liberty, oppose tyranny, and give equal opportunity in exposing the hypocrisy of the Democrats and the Republicans. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Joe and Joe.
Hey guys, great to be with you again tonight. I'm Joe, your economic host, bringing to you 10 years of analysis experience, not just experiments, on the markets and economics today.
And I am also Joe, your social host, working class Marine Corps veteran and street level activist for the Libertarian Party.
Okay, we've got a little bit of audio problems there. Joe's coming in a little bit distant there, so we'll be working on that as we try to, as we go into our breakdown of the episode tonight. So basically, everything that's been hitting the news is obvious. It's the riots that have been going on in the wake of George Floyd's death at the hands of a policeman, Officer Derek Chauvin. And this happened in Minneapolis a week from this past Monday. And ever since then, there has been total chaos in the streets as people have been demanded justice. In the wake of that, last episode, which you can catch on our Blog Talk Radio, and you can follow us on Facebook. We're also on Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Podcast and Buzzsprout. In the last episode, I was very I didn't know really what to think. I mean, obviously, I was horrified by all the riots that was going on, but I couldn't really process everything because, you know, the story was evolving, and it's still evolving to this day. But I think now I have reached a point where I've been thinking about this for a time, is I've been able to get to an analysis, at least of what I think is the root cause of this of these riots and these protests that have been going on. And really, I think there are three causes for the riots. So I'd like to discuss that, and I'm sure that my co-host, who is our political activist part of this duo here, he has a lot more experience with these kinds of things. So I know that he will be able to give his own take on that, and so I certainly welcome it. So going into the protests and just kind of recapping you, the protests started, and they were mostly peaceful starting off, and they were massive amounts of crowds, and it was obvious. African Americans have been seeing this. I mean, there was the Rodney King riots in L.A. There have been numerous deaths. Some of them have been high profile. There was the George Zimmerman shooting that he shot Trayvon Martin with back in 2012, and although Zimmerman was not a police officer at the time, it was considered very high profile because of the nature that led to Martin's death and why Zimmerman followed him. And then obviously there was Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. That one led to a huge amount of protest. And so it was very clear that after what had happened here, and there's a couple others. There was Eric Gardner up in New York City, and it seemed that in large part the African-American community had enough. And that was just, that was to be expected on this. And here was a cop who he was fired, but it seemed like, there was really no calls for justice. Where were the charges that were coming into play here? And eventually they did come out. But before the charges were made by the Minneapolis prosecutor, the entire nation erupted into total chaos with the riots. So riots started breaking out, and the rest is history. We all of a sudden started hearing how there was, cops shooting tear gas in the middle of the crowds. We saw the videos of, everybody burning and torching entire streets down to ashes, buildings caught on fire, breaking and entering, looting. It was all hell that had broken loose. All of civilization had broken down. All of society had just melted away. And honestly, there have been three narratives that have been kind of, been forming out of all of this. And these three narratives follow the three major strains of political thought. There's your liberal Democrat narrative, there is your conservative Republican narrative, and then there is the independent libertarian narrative. And there are grains and elements of truth in each narrative. Some, I think, are more true than others, and obviously we're libertarian, so you can probably guesstimate on which major school of thought we think is the most accurate. But the important thing to note here is that we're all trying to explain what happened, and one of the things that humans do to explain why things happen is create stories. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm saying making stuff up. We're not making things up. We're not creating falsehoods. Well, some of us are, I mean, just look at the mainstream media's, post out all the time. I mean, that's called propaganda. But when we create our narratives, we are creating stories to explain and give the motivation of why these things happened. So basically what you're getting is three whys. And I'm not going to go into depth about the liberal Democrats and the Republicans' whys, because quite frankly, that's not really important. It's not. I want to give you guys, and I'm sure that Joe, the political host, will 100% agree, what we think is the truth, what we think is true, regardless of us being libertarians. If libertarian idea is wrong, it's wrong on this. If it's right on this. But we're giving you what we think is absolutely 100% true. And so this is what I've been able to come up with. I think that that the riots and the protesters are two separate groups. Just like that there are wings of thought inside political parties. Let's take the Republican Party, for example. I came from the Republican Party. I spent years inside the Republican Party. So I can tell you there are wings of political ideological thought where even though they're under the same umbrella, they have totally different perspectives about things. Some Republicans are a little more, quote, radical, unquote, than other Republicans, and might resort to more drastic means to achieve the Republican political goal. But they all classify themselves and say, yeah, I'm a Republican. And I think that that's the case here in large protest groups like Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has been framed by the right-wing conservative media as a hate group that has just been calling all cops are pigs, and they're all calling destroyed. And then they'll play videos. They'll play videos and clips of some Black Lives Matter protest leader, chanting these things, and then we're all led to believe every single person who is Black Lives Matter is calling for the total, eradication of all police. And I'm not talking about dismantling of the police force. I'm talking about killing them in terms of vengeance. Basically it's honor blood killing. You took one of ours, now we're going to take yours. And then we're about to take that as gospel, that means that every single Black Lives Matter is like this. But then when you look at certain videos that have been coming on last week, and one of the ones I shared was where Black Lives Matter's protesters attended a Donald Trump Republican rally. And to the credit of the Trumpers that were hosting that rally, they allowed Black Lives Matter to come up there and speak. And so I listened to what that man said, and he said, look, we aren't here to, advocate for violence against the police. And some in the Republican crowds and there were, chanting liars to him and all this stuff. But he seemed to advocate it and said, all we want is peace. And so if you take those two things, it's possible that both strains are true. There is an element wing inside the Black Lives Matter movement that is calling for violent revolution. They're tapping into their inner Malcolm X. They're tapping into the Black Panther Party Marxist mantra of violent revolution. And then there is another strain that is more Martin Luther King Jr., where, they advocate for peaceful protests. But then there's also the realization that you have to take into effect these peaceful protests have been going on for 50 years, and we are still having these killings of unharmed African-American men, whether you regard it as justifiable or not. In this case, I think it's very obvious it's not justifiable in the least bit. Pretty much all sides agree on that for once. But nevertheless, there is an extreme group of protesters who have basically said enough is enough, and I think they contributed to the riots. But I think that they are a small element. Another root cause of the riots has nothing to do with the protest, and this one's coming from reports inside the police. These are coming from police reports from all over the states, and I know the police should be treated with suspect, but I think they're onto something here. I think they're accurate. From the arrests that they have made, they indicated that a lot of the arrests that were made against the looters and the thieves were small groups of individuals who were highly organized, and they were basically signaling to each other to break in and steal things, steal valuables. So they seem to have had connections where they would communicate with each other. They'd get in vehicles, they'd drive together, and they would signal to each other whether one place was open to be hit or not. And they would just go right around ransacking towns.
Opportunistic parasites. I talked about opportunistic parasites. I talked about that last week, that the company that I worked for, our store is miles away from any protest site, and we got hit by a team like that. It is opportunists that have absolutely no interest or care about the protests, that are taking advantage of a preoccupied police force to pursue their own gains. They are their own faction. Yep. You're right. I wholeheartedly agree.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's that is probably a major contributor factor to it. And then there's some disturbing pieces of things, and this one's more of the controversial. And the reason why it's controversial is not by what it proposes, but it's basically circumstantial. There are certain videos showing around where you have certain individuals who are at the protest, but they're clearly not part of the protest movement. They're not wearing any signs. They're not standing in front of the crowds, and they are suspiciously dressed head to toe in dark clothes and hoods. And by the way, from the videos that I've seen, they weren't African Americans either. And a lot of times they would be wearing things like they'd be wearing face masks to cover themselves, and they'd be wearing sunglasses, and they would have a hood over their head. And suspiciously, they would be seen walking just idly by down the street and smashing glass. And just as calm as you could be, just sitting there and smashing glass. And so some of the protesters started seeing them and following them and videotaping them. And they came up with the idea that maybe these were undercover cops that were deliberately trying to break glass and fan the flames of hatred, not to support the protesters, but in other words, to make the protesters look more violent than they actually were, so that public opinion would change on them. Now, that's completely circumstantial. I cannot verify that, not one bit. So I can't say that one bit. Lastly, I think that the third cause is based off of the impact of COVID-19. And you have to think about it like this. I'm not justifying looters and thieves, but I feel pretty certain that when you've lost your job, you've lost your income, even if you got magically put on unemployment, there are delays when that unemployment check can hit. Sometimes a $1,200 stimulus bill is just not enough. There are people who are stuck at home. They're already in a high-stress environment, and this just put them over the edge. And they are saying, you know what? I'm tired of it all. I'm sick of it. And I feel like that is a third group that has, kind of come in where these people are desperate. And when they're stealing for lack of a better word, to survive. They're certainly taking advantage of the situation, but they're not nearly as highly organized as these groups of professional thieves and looters. And then, of course, also disturbingly, you have another group of extremists on both the left and the right that, for different reasons, they are rioting and trying to encourage the protesters to riot for their own malicious political goals. So in the case of this, there have been reports in North Carolina where certain right-wing protest groups, they're not really been given by name because they're very loosely associated with each other, but they have been, going around and have been purposefully causing riots, and their whole purpose is similar to why the supposedly undercover cops were doing it, was to create a bad aura, a bad look on the protesters themselves, to make them look like they are these violent, heathenistic, total chaotic people that just want to destroy and burn everything to the ground and ransack and loot everything in sight. And so by doing this, they achieve their objective of purposefully putting a label on the groups in order to politically destroy their message. And their message is simple. Their message is justice. They want justice for George Floyd. They want to make sure that this never happens again. Those are the two things that they are doing that. And then you got some left-wing extremist groups that are purposefully involved to strike back against the police. And then there are some right-wing anarchist groups that, if they are involved, their involvement is because they want to support any kind of revolution against the police state or the systemic orders of society in order to overthrow those chains, because to them they are achieving their political goal as far as getting unleashing and really just illustrating the oppressive power of the state. So in their strategy, they are trying to create as much havoc so that way the state will respond with more force, so it will escalate the forces into a total war, so to say, a war zone. So what they're planning on doing is creating enough riots and looters that the police can't handle it all, so the governor has to send in the National Guard. Then you've got all this coverage about why the National Guard has been set in. Then the city mayors start instituting curfews, which are never popular, and that just causes even more antagonism. Then you've got people who violate those curfews. Then you have arrests made for people who simply violated curfews. Then you have more antagonism drawn against the state, which then leads to an escalating of more conflicts and conflicts with the police and the National Guard, and especially because we have a president who says things before he thinks about what he's saying, who insinuated this past week that he was going to send in military forces and basically put us under martial law, which should have horrified everybody, even if what Donald Trump was saying was just mere words. So you have that element broken into it. And if Donald Trump had followed through with that threat, then most certainly what you would have had would have been a huge uprising and a backlash against that. But the point is that none of this would have solved the issue. The answer does not come with, quote, more law and order. The answer, quote, comes from more equality and justice. And I'm not talking about equality of results. I'm talking about equal opportunities for people. George Floyd never had the opportunity to have his day in court, regardless of whether he was a criminal or not. George Floyd died before he was ever put on trial again for whatever he was being arrested for. And now we will never know. We will never know whether Floyd should have been in jail or not. He certainly didn't deserve to die for what he had allegedly committed. And, that's the thing. That's not equality. That's not justice. And on the second part about this, having officers, police themselves, where they will investigate themselves and not having another group investigate them is also not justice. That's not justice at all. You're basically trusting the police to police themselves. Yeah, that's worked real well. So those kinds of struggles are why these protests and rioters have, emerged. And whether you agree with them rightly or wrongly, I think everybody should agree with the protesters, but whether you are, mad at the rioters for what they have done, or whether you agree with the rioters or understand what the rioters are, without addressing the root causes, you're not going to really solve the problem. So, Joe, what do you think about what I have added to this?
I said my piece on the looters and my thoughts on that. The agents provocateurs, as I have heard them called, the police officers, that is going to unfortunately be nothing more than narrative and counter-narrative, so long as, maybe one day something gets declassified that counts as a, confession of now retired individuals in 30 years or something, but that will never be anything more than narrative. It will never be proven, and it will never really be disproven either, which is frustrating. There's been some pretty remarkable videos of, there's been videos of uniformed police officers breaking windows, videos of, mysterious pallets of bricks showing up away from construction sites, and I think I even saw a video of police dropping some of those off. There's quite a bit of primary source that can be deemed as compelling evidence to support the ideas of agents provocateurs. I'm not going to say too much more on your interpretation of it, because I pretty much agree with your interpretation, although I do have quite a bit to say on the whole matter. But we'll get to my part of this in a moment.
Mm-hmm. Can you do me a favor? Will you drop off the call and call back in? We seem to be having some interference on your sound. You seem to come out distant.
All right.
So, guys, while Joe is calling back in, we'll move on to the next piece of this. So, as I had indicated earlier, there have been certain strains of narratives started to form out in there, and they're pretty predictable. Take the left-wing Democrat narrative. George Floyd is an absolute hero. He should be honored. There have been narratives coming out how he was, going out and providing these things for society. He had been a very active member in the community. That seems to be the narrative for seeing everybody who has been killed by a police officer. They have been this upstanding citizen. Why they were being arrested, we don't know. But then, they die, and that's, absolutely god awful. And we have Joe calling back in. Joe, speak up.
Am I coming through any better?
Yep, you coming through perfect, my friend.
Excellent.
Yep.
I'm going to say my two-piece on what I just walked in, although I missed the introduction of it, regarding the left side narrative there that George is this upstanding saint of a citizen. I hope I'm not cutting you off or stealing your point. It doesn't fucking matter. Absolutely does not matter if he was even a good person. And the reason I say that, the nature of a justice system is that I take 100 from you, and you are due restitution of 100 from me. It is an eye for an eye. I personally, and this is a platform that I stand on with most libertarians, I fully support the idea that felons should have their rights, all their rights, firearm ownership, whatever it be, restored to them. And this criminal record idea that follows you for the rest of your life should not exist. And the reason I take that position is that the whole idea of prison and justice is that you have committed this crime, you have wronged your neighbor, and now you are going to pay the price. You are going to, as we say, the literal saying, pay your debt to society. When it comes my time for sentencing and I am guilty, don't do me any fucking favors. If I owe a debtor money, if I owe him 100 of something, I don't pay him back 50. The deal's not I pay him back 50 and then he lords it over me for the rest of my life. If we feel that George Floyd did not pay his debt to society for whatever crimes he may have committed in the past, he should still be in fucking prison until that debt is paid. And if we do feel that debt is paid, then leave the man the fuck alone. It shouldn't be following him. When you leave prison as a man who has paid his debts, you should have a clean slate. Period. I do not care what his criminal record was or what he has done in the past.
And there you have it, my friends. Joe, our political activist, giving us the libertarian take. Nicely done. So there's your narrative there. Now let's flip this into the past on the right-wing side. So in the right-wing conservative narrative, and I know where Joe's going to go with this argument because the logic applies the exact same way. They say that George Floyd was the devil himself. He had a long string of criminal records. He was not the saint, so he shouldn't be vilified as the hero. Now, to their credit, they don't say that this justifies the cop killing him. They're like, oh, no, the cop will get what he's due. But let's not pretend that George Floyd was an angel sent from heaven here. But, again, as what my colleague just said, that doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. It should not make a difference in the weight of the law. If you're guilty of something, you're punished for it. If you're not guilty, you're not punished for it. But for the right-wing side of it, they're trying to counter the claims, and this is where I can interject my own ability to read between the lines. They're not really trying to attack Floyd. What they are attacking is the left-wing narrative. So their narrative is the anti-narrative, which always takes the opposite balance, just as good and evil have opposite balances on it. They're trying to say, well, the left-wingers are completely disqualified because what they are trying to do is uphold this man who has been guilty of all these sins, all these crimes as an upstanding member of society, and so therefore, politically speaking, you cannot trust the Democrat narratives. It's no longer really about George Floyd. It's no longer really about whether there will be justice for that man. It's all about the narrative. And that's where your problem is. The libertarian, model here fits much more appropriately. Why? Because even though we have our own narrative, our narrative is based off the individual. We look at it on a case-by-case issue. Did Floyd do anything at this moment in time, not at the times in the past, anything that would justify the use of potentially lethal force against him? Yes or no? I think it's pretty clear from all the evidence. I'm not a judge, but I think it's pretty obvious. Pretty much did nothing, zero, to warrant the use of an officer to put his knee on his neck for, what's the running time? 7 minutes? Where it choked off enough oxygen to go to his lungs to where he could not get enough oxygen to keep his organs alive, regardless of how long it took for him to die. Pretty much. There's no justification. Therefore, the assailant, the killer, it does not matter if they are a policeman. What was that?
Sorry, you're good. Go ahead.
I said, therefore, the assailant, the killer, should be charged. And I think the charge of murder is appropriate here. It's not first-degree murder because it wasn't premeditated. It is second degree. It's been upgraded. But second degree also includes if you use force that you know could potentially kill somebody, even if you weren't intending to kill the person, still qualifies as second degree. Yeah, it's about second degree. And then the other three officers who just stood idly by and did absolutely nothing about it are going to be charged with aiding and abetting, which I also find appropriate. But let's recap here. It took a week of violent riots in the streets with America's cities nearly burned down to ashes in certain points just to drive home to the DA to say, maybe we need to be charging these people who have killed George Floyd. And that, my friends, is the whole reason of what's going wrong in our society. We like to pretend that we have moved past the era of Jim Crow, that we have moved past the era of police brutality on anyone, and it is nothing of the sort. Police brutality actions may be declining against minorities over time, that's true, but there has been such a huge number of them in our record past that it's just reached a boiling point where everybody is sick of it. And there's only so much that people can take. So likely, as I said last week, we've reached a bottleneck. It is now overflowing. Mount St. Helens has erupted. And this is the aftermath. Joe, do you have anything else to add?
Like I said, I've got my own take on the whole thing and, my own reflections and readings of the week that I'll go into when you're done.
Okay. So my last bit has to do with Candice Owens. In case if you guys don't know who Candice Owens is, Candice Owens is a hold on, Paul, we've got a caller on. Have you screened him yet? Hold on one second. We've got a caller that's moving on. Yeah, he is. He's got him in the green screen room. We've got Candice Owens. She was an African-American conservative commentator. Very right-wing, staunch Republican. She came out with a very informal video where she basically just lambasted the entire left-wing narrative about George Floyd. Basically, what she criticized was that Floyd was being upheld as the patron saint of, unjustified cop killings, that, he's been deified. And, she just basically ranted about it. She brought up some good points about him, about Floyd doesn't really change anything. We're again, all of this.
All right, guys, I've got Ed the Anti-Fed on the line. He's a big Anti-Federalist. So you want me to go ahead and bring him on the line? He said he likes what he's hearing.
Sure. Go ahead. Hey, Ed.
All right, Ed, thank you for holding. You were on the air.
Hi there. Hey, I like the name of your show, The Anti-Federalist. The Anti-Federalist, great name for a show. I go by Ed the Anti-Fed because I love the Anti-Federalist philosophy, which is decentralization and the Bill of Rights or unalienable rights. Just a canary in the hole type thing for unalienable rights. And that's what the Anti-Federalists were about. Yeah, I mean, what's going on now is ridiculous, man. It's been going on for so long. I mean, I recommend a good book for everybody to read. It's Battlefield America by Whitehead. I'm from Orlando. It has some of our activists here in Orlando in it. But Battlefield America was put out right around 2015, 2016, right before Trump got elected. But the guy gets into how we are becoming a police state. And if you look at all that stuff, I mean, in Buffalo, the police unions and the Democrats and Republicans are all in the same bed together, and that's the problem. And you look at what happened in Buffalo there. They knocked over that 77-year-old guy, and the whole squad says, well, if you're going to fire them guys for knocking over that guy and making him believe, we're not going to be policemen anymore. I mean, that's what we're up against.
No, I completely agree with you, Ed. Yeah, this has gone out of control. One of the things that I like to point out, and this is something that converted me to libertarianism, is that, libertarians would often take a strong stance, and they would say things like, they would talk about the police state. Back in my Republican days, I was like, what are you talking about, the police state? Police are not, they're just part of the members of the community. They're not oppressing us. And then time and time again, we are seeing examples coming out where the Libertarian Party has been shown to be right 100% of the time. Ron Paul was saying 8 years ago, talking about the injustices of the military involvement in the Middle East. And I was like, what in the world is he talking about? Go and research it, and like, son of a bitch, he's right.
Boy, you were, they had you brainwashed, didn't they? They did a good job brainwashing you. But,
exactly.
See, I came a teenager of age under Johnson and Nixon, probably the two worst presidents you can have. And, I've since Poor Dead in Ohio. I don't know if you know that song, Poor Dead in Ohio. But anyways, they killed 4 people in Kent State. You probably remember that. But, and I've seen many people get their heads split open in D.C. in the early 70s and stuff. And I've seen people probably set up people, throw bottles for a Hall of Justice, and cops coming out of the garage with the police. I'm like, this is a police state. But I recommend reading Battlefield America. That's a good book to read because, we're up against, this is the machine. These people that back Battlefield America, that back all these SWAT teams and all these things going on, and that it deals with the growth of the SWAT teams since the late 70s. And even the Department of Education has a SWAT team. Tell me why is that? Because when they need to employ them, they say, go out there in the streets now. Yeah.
Well, Ed, we appreciate what you've had and what you've contributed to us. Ed, the Anti-Federalist, we thank you. Moving on now, we are going to cover, I guess I will hand off the baton to Joe and have him give his take on what's been going on with all of this crisis. Joe, you ready?
Yeah, I can take it. So going into this show, I wasn't really sure what to talk about or what else I had to add because I mostly said my piece on the protests and the event last week. And when in doubt, I'll try to do a little bit of reading and get some inspiration. And this week I turned to John Locke. And I'll be damned if it didn't read like scripture. I mean, it's pretty spot on. But where I want to start is I got to thinking about the expression white privilege. And I've been mulling on it. And I will never deny that it is a thing. I wholeheartedly believe that it is a thing. But there's always been something I've been a little stuck on that I couldn't put my finger down, and I finally figured it out. It is a thing. It is a mislabeled thing. We've misnamed it. To say white privilege. Because a privilege is this special luxury allotted to you. And I think that's where I was always kind of stuck on it, is because I knew that I enjoyed things that other demographics did not, but I never really felt like it was a privilege. I don't feel privileged. And I'm not. We have misnamed it. It's not white privilege. Human right. I don't enjoy anything special. It is not that society lives at this standard and I am enjoying being elevated above it. As Locke would say, we as people, we form societies and we consent to be governed in the interest of securing our rights to life, liberty, and property. And I enjoy that security. I am secure in my life and liberty and property. But this same institution that is securing those things for me is not securing them for everybody. And in many cases, it is deliberately denying it and systematically denying it to other demographics. It is not white privilege. It is human right. And I can go into, I'm going to address how the black community is specifically being denied these things to my own knowledge. I'm not especially well researched on it, and I'm not going to talk about any other demographics for now because God knows as long as Trump is president, and I do believe it'll be another 4 years, I'll absolutely have my opportunities with everyone else. The Hispanic community is his favorite scapegoat, and I'm sure we'll be there in a few weeks talking about whatever he's done there. But just starting out with the 14th Amendment and the end of slavery, we made penal exceptions. Slave labor was absolutely outlawed unless as a punishment. And you can still occasionally see chain gangs on your local highways cleaning up trash in jumpsuits. Mike Bloomberg, during his campaign, got hemmed up because he accidentally, unknowingly is the best way to put it, he contracted out to some company, and that company was using prison labor. We call it prison labor. We don't call it slave labor, but that's literally what it is. And when you look back, right out of the gate, right at the end of the Civil War, we freed the slaves. And now this entire region of the nation's economy is just in a state of what the fuck are we doing? The first thing we do is we come up with vagrancy laws. If you're black, you have to have a job, and you have to have papers proving you have a job. And if you can't prove that, you can't demonstrate that you're an active, contributing member of society, you're going to prison. And once you go to prison, you're going to the fields. And you're right back where you were 6 years ago before the war started. But nobody's going to hire you because you're living in the Deep South. Everyone's racist. Nobody wants to hire a black person. So you can't find a job. And if you can't find a job, you're going to jail. So what do? Well, in many cases, they started opening their own businesses or attempting to. And the next thing you know, you have licensing and franchising, licensing and permitting. Do you have the license to do the work you're doing? No. You've got to pass this test. Well, first, you need to be literate. Nobody's teaching you to read or write. It's not enough that you've learned how to do this thing, that you figured out enough to be able to provide a service that some people will pay you for. That's not enough. You have to demonstrate to your local government via this written test that you understand it to this standard we have established so that we will issue you a license, which you, of course, have to buy, in order to do this work. And now we're establishing these bureaucratic barriers so that it is that much harder. And those still exist. Obviously, if you've ever tried to get into these kinds of things, any kind of trade, any kind of businesses, you have to get licenses, you have to get permits, and that's exactly what they are. It's bureaucratic red tape, and it's stuff you have to buy, you have to pay this, you have to get this inspection. And those things are simply more difficult for underprivileged communities. I'm using the exact word that I didn't want to, is privilege. It's harder when you are not secure in your right to live life, liberty, and property. And we see decades of this, and in the communities where they started to build up, and in spite of these barriers, started to secure the rights to life, liberty, and property for themselves, we see things like the burning of Black Wall Street, where 300 people died in race riots and just outright murder. And I'm going to dive back into Locke, John Locke, because he nails it so beautifully. He talks about the state of nature. And justice in the state of nature is you wrong me, and I am due restitution equal to what was deprived of me. And in a wild society, this isn't supernaturally reliable, because I'm going to be passionate and probably angry,
And I'm going to be inclined, if you took 100 units of whatever from me, I'm inclined to take 120 to teach you your lesson. And that's not justice. So we form societies and we consent to governments so that there are neutral parties, judges, and a judicial system that is there to observe, determine the truth as best they're able, and if I am wronged by 100 units, I am given 100 units in restitution, not more, not less. I meant to pull the statistics, and I can't directly quote them. Bernie Sanders loves to throw these numbers out, where we see things like there's near equal use of marijuana between white and black communities, but an African-American person is 4 times more likely to go to jail for it. Take that 4 times with a grain of salt. I'm trying to quote statistics from memory, and I'm not great at it. We see that, yes, white people have more interactions with police and more lethal interactions with police, but when you go per capita and consider what percentage of the nation's population is white versus black, we see that a black person is much more likely to be killed in interaction with a police officer. And we see that this justice system is systematically out to get a particular community and continue to deprive them of their basic God-given rights of life, liberty, and property. And this is why I emphasize it's not white privilege, because I am not being given a thing. I am being secured what is basic, and what is given to me by God is secured to me. And everyone else is being denied it. It's not that everyone else has basic and I am given something extra. I am given basic and everyone else is being denied that. And the opposite of the state of nature is the state of war. If anybody is interested, I encourage you to read on this, because the fact is I could have taken this entire podcast episode to just read that chapter of 2 Treatises of Government, which is John Locke's book, The State of War, and what that means and what brings it about. I've written down a couple of passages from it that I am going to read verbatim to make the point, but the whole thing reads like freaking prophecy. It is so accurate to what we are observing in the world around us right now. And I'll start right here. What he defines as a state of war is using force or violence to gain something from me. And that's different from simple judicial what have you. It's not a simple crime because of the incorporation of force and violence. And Locke is a little tough to read. When you start out, you're like, what the hell is he talking about? But he's very redundant. He reiterates himself 19 times, and by the time you get to the end of the chapter, you thoroughly understand what he means, and it comes out very well. I will do my best, and I hope I can portray his meaning via these couple of passages. For I have reason to conclude that he who would get me into his power without my consent would use me as he pleased when he got me there, and destroy me too when he had a fancy to it. For nobody can desire to have me in his absolute power unless it be to compel me by force to that which is against the right of my freedom, that is, make me a slave. I have no reason to pose, this is a separate passage, I have no reason to pose that he would take away my liberty, that he who would take away my liberty would not, when he had me in his power, take away everything else. And therefore, it is lawful for me to treat him as one who has put himself into a state of war with me, that is, kill him if I can. For to that hazard does he justly expose himself, he who produces a state of war and is aggressor in it. I can't read that chapter without seeing that officer's face as he knelt on that man, as he got this person into his absolute power and destroyed him at his fancy. And it's not an isolated incident. It's enough names that I can't recall them, and some of them slip by and I'm never even aware of them. And that's the point. is that this judicial system is putting itself in a state of war with the black community. The black community is not the aggressor in this. And John Locke even goes so far as to directly reference a state of war being produced when you are a member of a member of a civil society and a governed society, and that government is actively working against you. He even nails it. And I want to make this point to anyone listening who is of the same demographic of me. It's not privilege that you're enjoying. It is basic right. And you have no obligation to earn your right. You have no obligation to use your God-given rights to anyone's benefit but yours. You do not, it does not fall upon you to help your neighbor. You are obligated to heed him, but you are not obligated to help them, as the word privilege implies
guys,
that you are. But
got a call on the line. Sorry, you want to finish up?
Let me wrap my thoughts up before we bring him in.
Gotcha.
Let me wrap my thoughts up on this before I bring him in. You do not have that obligation to step in and use your rights to help your neighbor secure theirs. But I want to make this point. If you will not advocate for your neighbor and stand beside your neighbor in their plight simply because it is the right thing to do, then do it because it is actually in your own interest. Because a state of war is never a clean thing. There's never been a war that did not have spillover and collateral damage and civilian casualties and war crimes. And while you have a right to abstain from that conflict and be a non-combatant, that war may still find its way to you. And we're already seeing that in the places where it is getting the most violent. We're seeing store owners who have to make the decision, who 2 weeks ago were completely secure in their life, their liberty, and their property, who are now having to make the decision, do I stay in my home where I am relatively safe and be secure in my life at the expense of my property downtown, and thus be secure in my life at the forfeit of my right to property, or do I wager my life in an effort to go and secure my property? And we've already seen the videos like the guy in Dallas who wagered his life and lost it. This war stands to take from you. So if you will not advocate for your neighbor purely because it is the right thing to do, advocate for him and fight for him, because by securing their rights, you are also securing your own. By all means, Paul, bring the caller in.
Oh, Roger, thank you for holding, sir. We've got Zachary on the line. He said he does have some disagreements, but he's going to be cool and respectful.
Yes, of course. I think dialogue is very much needed, not only from the left to the right, but I believe that I'm probably further right than y'all. But still, we can't expect the enemy to have dialogue if we can't have it ourselves. I would like to have a very respectful conversation. I would like to call out some things I see as fallacies in your ideology, especially with the current events. And if you would give me a few minutes of your time, I think we could do a good show, a good conversation, and have a good talk.
So, hey, Zach, this is Joe. I'm the economic host on this one. Yeah, we are more than happy to have you on, buddy, and stuff, and we'll try to keep this as cordial as possible. Just 1 second while Joe and I decide which one of us are going to tag into the ring with you right quick. So, Joe, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to?
I'll take you both one.
I'll hear what you both one.
Economics I can do, and also social issues I can do. I'll take you both one. Just be respectful and don't talk over each other.
I think that's the important part about that, Zach. So, all right, buddy. Well, you go ahead and you take the first round.
So I would say that I enjoy your broadcast. I think it's important what you're doing. And as I was listening, the reason I called in, You said something that was very telling to me. You're framing this like very weird libertarian idea. I mean, I'm not saying libertarianism is weird, but you're framing this ideology that the victim is always right. You're talking about George Floyd and other blacks who have been killed by police officers, but you have not once brought up whites who have been killed by police officers. You're placating. You're actually placating. George Floyd didn't die from a knee on his neck. He died from a fentanyl overdose. That's already been proved. They've already done the autopsy. Every cop will get off. He had fentanyl in his system 5 times the amount that would kill somebody. And you say these things like, and it's so weird. If you really believe that, race doesn't exist, how come 90% of blacks, 90% of Hispanics, 90% of Indians, they all vote left? They all vote left. So why are you trying to get why are you trying to stick up for them? They're not on your team. And if you watch these riots, they're saying very clearly what they believe. They believe in black nationalism, black power. I live in South Carolina. Just the other night we had a riot down here, and they drug a white man out in the street and killed him, beat him to death, and it went viral. Why are you trying to defend people who hate you? They don't want nothing to do with the Constitution. They don't want nothing to do with America. They hate it. They hate it. You will never win them because it's not in their culture. They are collectivists. They are tribal. And you're defending them, and it's actually pretty sickening.
So Joe, I'll take it. I got it. First off, your
hold on. Can I take the first shot?
I didn't reference. Sure.
I just want to say, and I was talking about how you were saying they are collectivists, they are nationalists. Zach, I want to point out something to you, and I mean this. I mean for this as a reflection, not as a gotcha. What you just said when you lumped them into the group they, that is collectivist thinking. So you're accusing them of being collectivists, but what you are saying is actually collectivist thought by labeling them all in that group as if they were all guilty for the actions of some.
That's wrong. That's wrong. You're very wrong.
That's what you just did. That's what you just did, Zach. You just did that.
I will use facts to back up my opinion. Yes, it is collective. I think this is a proto race war. Absolutely. 50%.
But my point.
56. Tell me why. So if 90% of blacks, 90% of Hispanics vote Democrat, that's not a collective? That's not a collective? That's not a collective culture?
No, a collective is the board from Star Trek where every single one is now working in unanimous consensus with each other. Yes, they're all individuals. They all make that decisions. That's not a collective. That's a generalization. That's all I'm going to say on that part.
It's not. It's not. So you tell me this. If 26% of blacks voted Republican, we would never see another Democratic president. But once we lose Florida or Florida or Texas, we'll never see another Republican president. Races vote collectively. You can't deny that. That's and to do so is ignorant. I mean, it's not racist. It's not hatred. Races vote collectively. That we can map that and graph that through every election since 1926. That's easily verified. So why are you trying to take up for people who don't give two shits about your ideology? Why? They want to kill you. They want to kill you. Why are you taking up for them? So how are you going to defend property against people who have no respect for property? You're taking up for the rioters and the protesters when they're kicking in doors in D.C.s. They're burning down private businesses because you don't want to be called a racist. That's insanity. This is a war against the white man. You better realize that because you can walk out there and kiss their boot and say, "Oh, I support your protest" and all this. At the end of the day, you're going to get a brick to the head because they hate you. They hate you.
So every single one, you mean to tell me that every single black person hates me? You think that every single black person hates me?
Of course not. Of course not. Of course not. Of course not.
Then you cannot say they. Then Zach, you cannot say they because that lumps in everyone and it makes everybody guilty for the actions of a few. Just like we know that not all cops are Officer Derek Chauvin. We know that. We know that without a shadow of a doubt. But we cannot say that collectively. We cannot say collectively that all cops are good, because guess what? No, hold on.
Zach, yes, I have. I'm a little broken.
Have you ever been to war?
Yes.
Okay, so what was your MOS?
What was that?
What was your MOS?
My month of service?
No, your job. No, he was Navy.
Your job.
No, I was a rating. So I was an aerographer's mate.
Okay, so let me explain it this way. So not all races are 100% in it together. That's insanity, and I would never expunge that. That's crazy. But there is a collective cultural thought that happens everywhere. You go to Afghanistan, you go to Iraq. They might not all agree on politics, but you can't trust the person next to you, because at the end of the day, we have seen time and time again, at the end of the day, they stick with their culture. That's a fact. That is a fact. People stick with their culture. And the police in Minneapolis, they were wrong. They were very wrong. But to play.
So let me ask you something. Have you ever heard of the economist Thomas Sowell?
Yes, I have.
He's my favorite economist, and I mean that sincerely. His ethnicity is African American. Do you mean to tell me Thomas Sowell, who in my opinion is the most prominent African American economist ever walked the face of this earth, do you mean to tell me that he is part of that collective?
Name two more. Name two more black libertarian leaders.
Walter Williams. Walter Williams. Walter Williams is the other economist. Do you name me any left-wing liberal economists that are African American?
I'm not left-leaning. Yes, I can actually. I'm not left-leaning, but I mean, especially when you go into like revolutionary idea.
So
you have Marcus Garvey, Huey Newton, Malcolm X. Let's see. Who else do you want?
He's not an economist. He was a political leader.
I'm going to step in and point out that the two of you are currently trying to measure who knows more about a matter in an effort to discredit the other. And I'm going to step in myself here. I'm not going to go back and forth with you to attempt to counter every one of your points. Many of them I've either countered in this episode or the last. You mentioned that I made no mention of police brutality against white people, and I did specifically refer to that as it pertains per capita, but I'm going to make this point. I live in a predominantly black community. I myself am white, but Greensboro is still basically divided along its traditional segregation lines of a white side of town and a black side of town. And while those are no longer legal barriers, I live on the side of town that is still predominantly African American. And I was a bouncer for 2.5 years on this side of town. And I'm kind of beating around the bush here, but it's pretty straightforward to refer to anybody as overly collectivist is inaccurate when you're submerged in a community and you observe the individualism. I've been an asset protection associate, and what I mean by an asset protection associate is that I secure, I fight shrink, I capture shoplifters, and my entire team, aside from myself, is black. And when I have bounced in predominantly black bars, I am the only white bouncer there, surrounded by a team of black bouncers. And I have suffered racism in this community. I have encountered racists here, and I have encountered people that want to harm me for being white. But when I am outnumbered, I am bailed out by my black coworkers. And in that moment, they are choosing their faction, the guy wearing the security shirt, they are choosing my security and fighting next to me, and I do mean fighting in the most literal sense, against members of their own race. in this moment of collectivism, they elect to collect with, and I have,
this is a straw
by
man.
an immense minority.
This is a straw man, dude. No, they're not fighting for you. They're fighting for their job. Come on. No, wait. I live in Florence, South Carolina. I'm about a freaking hour or two deeper in the South than you, and I'm a white boy in the deep South. Come on. I mean, I have no problem with black people on a personal level. None at all. But if you want to take your experiences from working and having your coworkers take up for you, that's insanity. You explain to me why
have you been a
blacks
bouncer?
vote Democrat. So why do 90% of blacks vote Democrat? How do we win them over?
I don't care.
How do we win them over?
That's their decision. What is this we?
Republic.
On the record,
you want a republic?
I do not care about Republicans.
No, I'm not. I said a republic. Do you believe you're a libertarian? You believe in libertarian ideology? Free market.
I absolutely
do. How come nowhere
Yep.
in the world? How come nowhere in the world, without people involving themselves within that group, only white people reproduce that? How come that happens? How come blacks don't vote for constitutional ideas? How come?
You're saying that the black community is against you and waging a war against you because they didn't vote for the guy you want in.
A guy I want in. Who's the guy I want in? I don't vote. The system's a fraud.
Then what do you care who they vote for?
Because it's a reflection. It's a reflection. So once they have a majority, we are done. Our ideas are done. We're done. And actually, it's about to come down to 2 states.
Then I guess I'm done. You and I are not going to find any common ground on this. If they're going to march up to my house and burn it down and kill me and string me up in my front yard, then I guess I had that coming, and you're right.
No, but tell me why it's so important to take up for them when they don't vote for our ideas.
Because of John Locke, and I think you should read him because he just got done. Joe Swigert just got done saying that. In defending their rights, we are securing our own. If you do not defend another person's right, even if you disagree with them, then you are giving the state the power to deny you your rights.
That's insanity. The state comes from the collective. The state comes from the community. The state is an abstract thought. The people create the state. The majority creates the state. There is no imaginary wand that just makes a state. A state is a people, a culture, a religion. Look all around the world. That's what it is. A people, a culture, a religion. So you want to tell me
let
you will take up
let me say this.
burning down your cities because my free markets.
So you've made my point for me entirely. And my point was that this system is designed to keep that community oppressed. And when you say that the moment they outnumber us, we are done, makes that point for me because you are fearful that if that majority flips, that same system is going to move against you.
You just advocated for fear, buddy.
Tell me one nation in the world. Tell me one nation in the world. Black, brown, yellow, any nation, any people. Tell me one nation in the world that exposes a free democracy or republic that isn't white. Tell me one. So how is it magically going to happen?
Tell me one that.
So you're saying that white people are the only people that stand for democracy and liberty.
Of course, in a majority, of course.
And how are you not racist?
Tell me.
I'm just saying that sounds kind of white supremacist there.
Well, no, I'm not. Well, first of all, I hate that term. I don't think that.
I know, but
you got to realize, man,
it just
you
sounds
sound like you're sitting there with
way.
a copy of the Turner Diaries in your basement.
Oh wow, that's crazy.
We've gone in circles. We're reiterating each other's points. I think we're good, Paul.
All right, Zach. Thanks a lot for calling in, and you're going to have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.
Yeah, guys.
All right, you guys proceed.
Yeah, I think he was clearly a white supremacist. He just didn't want to say that he was, but that's just my take on it.
When he said, first of all, I hate that word, what that really means is that I abide by those ideologies but don't fit that label, or I don't like that label.
Right.
My
whole point
in probably more to admit to what he really is.
My point in arguing with him is that when he was giving off his take, it just something didn't sound right, and so that's why I argued with him on those points. And
we've cut him off.
He's no
longer here to defend himself, so let's stop beating up on him.
Sure. So, all right. So, anything else that you've got, Joe?
I've said my piece. I think we're probably hitting close to an hour 10.
Yeah. So I like to talk about a couple of the last things, and because what you were touching on right before he jumped on for that entertaining diversion, I would like to point out that I think a couple of things that are exacerbating the problems that are going on in minority communities and such, and I think you touched on it. One is obviously the war on drugs. So we were talking about how the contact with police between African American communities versus white communities, African Americans per capita are disproportionately more likely to have any kind of contact with the police. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they live in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, they're poor, and because of that, it leads to higher rates of crime because of a lack of necessities, and also because drugs kind of flood into the streets. And so by doing that, they gain sort of a reputation that says, all right, well, we know which neighborhoods are the problem areas. So the cops go to those neighborhoods, they interact more, and in large part, the cops, sit there and arrest the perpetrators who are doing breaking and entering, they're thieves. But, Bernie Sanders was pointing out how disproportionately African Americans are more likely to go to jail for drugs than non-African Americans, predominantly Caucasians. I think he's right, but I think he's right on a level of not just because of racism, but because of the socioeconomic status that has flooded that. And so unless if we address the root causes of the socioeconomic status, we're really not going to address the issues of why there's so much contact with the police between the African American communities. Your thoughts on that?
I mostly said it. And, Joe made a good point about it last week when he was talking about how, the NYPD philosophy at one point was police the hell out of the minor little things in the effort to try to curb the big things, and realizing that really just turned into over-policing. Repeat the question one more time. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying that Bernie Sanders was making the point, right, that the African American communities are likely to come in contact with the police than Caucasians, and mostly due to drugs. And I was just pointing out that I think a lot of that has to do with socioeconomic status. So, do you agree with that, or do you think that there are more? There's obviously more to it, but do you agree with that that's like a major contributor?
I do agree that it's a major contributor. There's the historic nonsense to it. Going back to the crack epidemic and the CIA's involvement with that, and the Iran-Contra affair, and the fact that we were essentially selling crack in our own cities to fund terrorism in Nicaragua. Up to, Mike Bloomberg, when he was mayor, he's been on audio, not even secret recordings, but at a microphone, talking about how in an effort to protect those communities, stop and frisk, he over-policed them, he ruined people's lives because in his God complex felt that was the best way to protect them from themselves. It is quite often, especially in reference to the person you named, Bernie Sanders, in some cases, it's not necessarily overt racism. It's often misguided attempts to help people. And, this is a soapbox I've been wanting to stand on for a few nights, and I'm finally being given the opportunity. We're talking about the descendants of the people that survived the ships and the markets and the fields and the lynchings and the fire hoses and the dogs. And now we advertise these things like the left-leaning philosophy is, if not for the intervention of things like welfare and Section 8 housing and food stamps, this community cannot possibly survive. This community is the literally pruned, chosen, Darwinistic survivors. They are absolutely survivors. And the only thing they need to thrive is for the government to get the fuck out of their way. And we're talking about weed. Weed is my favorite thing to talk about on this matter, because Bernie Sanders talks about legalizing and decriminalizing, or not decriminalizing, regulating marijuana. And he quotes that statistic. He quotes about the over-policing and how these policies of his are going to do so much for the black community. And he advertises it like that guy standing on the corner selling weed is not going to go to jail anymore. He's wrong. He's well-meaning but misguided, because that guy is still going to go to jail, not for possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, but for distributing a controlled substance without a license. It is once more a modern vagrancy law, because what he's doing is still illegal. And that guy with an 850 credit score and $30,000 liquid capital is going to open up a licensed, permitted, inspected state dispensary. And he's going to run his business that way. And anybody that's buying weed has a choice to make. Do I go to the guy on the corner, whom it's still illegal to buy from, or do I go to the state-owned dispensary where I'm not breaking a law? And that's a pretty easy choice. So you've actually managed to still put the same guy in jail and also deprive him of his business, and actually not put money in that community, but deprive it of one more means of its informal economy. And this is why I say that libertarians, we are absolutely harmonious with progressives when it comes to social ideas, but we disagree on economics. Because we're all on the same team there. We want to legalize, and we want to legalize marijuana because we think it'll be good for this community. But whereas they want to regulate it without realizing that that's a continuation of the same systematic oppression the community has always experienced, we want to deregulate it and leave these people the fuck alone. That's my piece on that.
Yeah. So with that, goes into the socioeconomic situations, and this is where you get into hairy stuff, because as with all things in economics, it is not a straightforward path. It is a spider web, and it is easy to get caught, to be trapped, to get lost in the woods, and you don't even have a map. And that is going to have to be a topic of another day. But I think what I'll do is discuss that on next podcast, is basically the way that our market system is set up, which has been, it is not free market economics, so it's not full-blown capitalism, but it's neither full-blown socialism either. It's a hybrid, and I like to call it socialistic capitalism. And so therefore it has elements of both, and because of that it has problems. It has the problems of certain socialistic issues that have crept into it. And one of those problems of socialism is ironically high amounts of wealth and income inequality, because it's extreme inside of socialistic governments. You have a small, disproportionate amount of group of people that control not just 90% of the wealth, not 99% of the wealth, but practically 100% of the wealth. And then you have the vast amount of people who have nothing, like zero, and they're starving in the streets. So, I think I'll discuss on the next podcast on why that is. Why is our economy set up that way, and how that has contributed to basically the poor staying poor and all the problems that come with that. And ironically, it leads to higher crime rates, which then leads to more interactions with the police. Joe, do you know what you'll cover next week?
One of these days I'll get to infrastructure, but the year is 2020, and we can't make it 30 minutes without a near-apocalyptic situation that has to be covered. So, who knows?
Exactly. So, guys, we want to thank you for listening to Anti-Federalist Radio. Next week, stay tuned, because also I'm going to give you the update on the economy. One of the major things that I am looking for is the price inflation reports, because in my opinion, that's going to be key as to tell us just how stable or unstable our economy is at the moment. I'll give you that update, and also give you my insights as to where I think we are headed in the market system, because every single day something new comes out. So once again, thank you for listening to Anti-Federalist Radio. You can find us on Facebook at Anti-Federalist Radio. If you want to email us with some questions or comments, or if you'd like to join our podcast and schedule that, reach out to us at antifederalistradio@gmail.com. If you want to call in and reach us and be a guest on our show, you can reach us while we're live at 516-418-5584. And you can also email us as well. You guys, you can find us on Blog Talk Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Podcast. If you would like to listen to us, once again, we thank you for listening to us. This is Anti-Federalist Radio, and we're signing out.
Welcome to Anti-Federalist Radio.